All right, welcome back. I'm so excited for this deep dive because it's hitting on something I know you're all about, like that aha feeling when you learn something new. We're going to be looking at secure coding.
Secure coding, yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at a couple excerpts from Secure and Resilient Software Development.
Okay.
And we're going to be talking about how programming, like how software developers think about their code,
Yeah.
impacts the security of like everything we do online.
Which most of us have no idea about, we just kind of assume like, oh, it's all secure.
Right, yeah,
But it's fascinating to kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit.
absolutely.
So let's start with this. There's this amazing story about a security researcher named Dan Kaminsky. And he discovered this massive vulnerability in something called the domain name system, DNS.
DNS.
And for those of us who don't know, think of DNS as like the internet's phone book.
Right, yeah. It's what translates those website names that we can read
Right.
into the actual like IP addresses that computers use.
Yeah, those number things. Okay, so this vulnerability that he found was a really big deal. It could have like disrupted how people access websites like across the whole internet.
Yeah, it was a really big deal. But what's so interesting is that the solution was already out there. And it was thanks to something that a programmer named Daniel J. Bernstein had done years earlier.
So like someone accidentally saved the internet?
Yeah. So Bernstein had implemented something called source port randomization.
Hmm?
And that's basically a security measure where your computer uses a random port number when it's sending out these network requests.
Ah.
At the time, it didn't even have anything to do with the vulnerability that Kaminsky found. It wasn't even really on the radar.
So how did it help?
Well, it turns out that this randomization made it much, much harder for attackers to exploit the flaw that Kaminsky discovered in the DNS.
Wow.
So it basically threw a wrench in their plans, made it much less effective.
That's amazing. It's like a happy accident that protected the internet.
It is.
Does that happen a lot? These like happy accidents in software development?
Well, I don't know about accidents.
Yeah.
But good design, good software design, a lot of times is about anticipating future problems that we can't even imagine yet.
Right.
So just like what Bernstein did, it's about making choices that create a more secure foundation. Even if you don't know exactly what attacks might come in the future,
Right.
you're just trying to like build something that's strong from the ground up.
So it's not just about putting up walls. It's about building a structure that can withstand anything that comes at it.
Exactly. And that brings us to a group that's really good at identifying those potential threats. The Open Web Application Security Project, or OWASP. Have you heard of these guys?
I feel like I have.
Yeah, so they put together this list called the OWASP Top 10,
Okay.
which is essentially a list of the most critical web application security risks.
It's like the security Bible for web developers.
It is. A lot of people use this. It's referenced by the FTC, the Department of Defense, even the folks who set the standards for credit card security. Yeah, so when they say something is a risk, people listen.
Okay, so let's break down some of these risks, the ones that really, keep security folks up at night. What's at the top of this list? Like, what's the scariest thing out there?
Right at the top, you've got injection.
Injection.
So think about all the forms you fill out online, all the search boxes.
Yeah.
Injection is when an attacker can sneak in some malicious code through those entry points.
Okay. And what's the worst that could happen? Someone changes my search results to show cat videos instead of what I'm actually looking for.
Well, that'd be annoying.
Yeah.
But it could be much more serious. So imagine an attacker gaining control of a whole website, like a whole server,
Oh, wow.
just by exploiting a weak form field. So they could steal data, deface the website. They could even use it to launch attacks on other systems.
It's like breaking into a house through an unlocked window.
Exactly.
Okay, so I've also heard of this one. It's called cross-site scripting. XSS, I think?
XSS, yeah. That's the most common web application flaw out there.
Right.
Yeah. And it's when attackers inject malicious scripts into websites that you visit.
Okay.
So think about this. You're on your favorite social media website, you're reading a post, suddenly a pop-up appears that looks totally legitimate.
Right.
But it's actually a trap set by an attacker to steal your login credentials.
Ugh. So it's like being tricked into opening a door for a burglar because they're wearing a familiar uniform.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
And it can be so hard to detect because the attack is coming from a website you already trust.
Right. Okay, now broken authentication. This one hits close to home for me.
Yeah.
Who hasn't been frustrated by bad password rules?
Right.
It's the worst.
It is. But it's not just about annoying password requirements. It's really about how websites and applications verify your identity,
Right.
and manage those login sessions. So when authentication is broken, attackers can potentially bypass logins, steal accounts, they can impersonate users. You'd be surprised how often even big companies get this wrong.
Really? I guess it's more complicated than it seems on the surface.
It is.
Okay, what about cross-site request forgery? That sounds intense.
It's a mouthful, I know.
Yeah.
But it's a really sneaky attack. So imagine you're logged into your bank account,
Okay.
and then you click a link that takes you to a totally harmless-looking website. But hidden on that website is code that sends a request to your bank without you knowing.
Wait, so a malicious website can be making requests on my behalf while I'm still logged in somewhere else?
Exactly. And since you're still logged in, the bank thinks it's you making those requests.
Wow.
So it could be something like transferring money or changing your account settings, all without you ever realizing what happened.
That's scary. It's like someone hijacking your identity while you're still holding your driver's license.
Oh.
Okay, so we've got injection, cross-site scripting, broken authentication, and cross-site request forgery. What about the rest of this top 10 list?
So we also have insecure direct object references, security misconfiguration, failure to restrict URL access, unvalidated redirects and forwards, insecure cryptographic storage, and insufficient transport layer protection.
It's like a whole arsenal of weapons that people can use to attack these websites and applications, so that's kind of scary. But this OWASP Top 10 is a great resource for people to know what to look for, right?
It is. It's really important. It gives organizations a roadmap to identify and mitigate the most dangerous risks.
So it's like a security checklist for the internet.
Yeah.
So knowing all this, all these potential risks, what can developers do to make sure their applications are actually secure?
Well, that's where OWASP offers another amazing resource, the Enterprise Security API, or ESAPI.
ESAPI sounds like a superhero.
Right, well, kind of is.
Yeah.
Think of it as a toolkit that takes care of all the essential, but sometimes really tedious security tasks,
Right.
so that developers can focus on building those cool features without having to become security experts themselves.
So it's like a security sidekick for developers.
Exactly.
It does all the boring stuff.
That does, yeah.
And it provides these pre-built security controls, so it's much more efficient and secure than trying to build everything from scratch. That makes a lot of sense, trying to handle security on top of everything else.
Yeah.
Must be a lot for developers.
It is, and that's where ESAPI really comes in. It's like having a whole team of security experts working behind the scenes to protect your application.
Okay, so we've talked about the OWASP Top 10, which is kind of like a list of these security nightmares.
Right.
And then we've got ESAPI, which is like the security superhero toolkit for developers.
Yeah.
What else should people know about how software impacts their security? What other things are out there?
Well, one thing that's often overlooked is something called input validation.
Input validation. So is that just about like making sure people fill out forms correctly?
It is part of it, but it's
Uh-huh.
much broader than that. It's
Yeah.
really about scrutinizing every piece of data that comes into your application, no matter where it comes from.
Okay.
We're talking about data from forms, hidden fields, cookies, HTTP headers, even things you might not think of, like sensor data or API calls.
Okay, so it's like a security checkpoint for any information that's trying to get into the applications world.
Exactly. And it's incredibly important because seemingly harmless data can be weaponized if it's not properly validated. You wouldn't let just anyone walk into your house without checking their ID, right?
Yeah.
Input validation is like that ID check for your application.
That's a good way to put it.
Mm.
Okay, so what happens when that ID check fails? Like, what's the worst that could happen?
Well, to understand that, we need to talk about some of the tools that attackers use to exploit weak input validation.
Okay.
And one of the most powerful tools is called Burp.
Burp, like the sound you make after eating.
Not quite.
Okay.
It's this really powerful tool that allows hackers to intercept and modify data that's being transmitted between your web browser and a server.
So it's like someone listening in on a phone call and changing the words before they reach the other person.
Yes, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So Burp allows them to manipulate data in transit. They can inject malicious code. They can essentially take control of the communication between you and a website. That's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, that is unsettling. It makes you realize how much trust we put into these systems every day. Like, we don't even think about it.
We don't. And that trust can be shattered if the right security measures aren't in place. And input validation is one of those foundational security measures that can prevent a lot of these attacks from even happening.
So it's like the first line of defense.
It is.
that can stop an attack before it even starts.
Exactly. And that's why it's so critical for developers to really understand how important input validation is
Right.
and to use the right tools and techniques to make sure it's working correctly.
This is fascinating stuff. I never realized how much is going on behind the scenes
I know, right?
to keep our online interactions secure.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
And it makes you appreciate all the work that developers do to protect us from these threats. It's like a constant battle.
It is, but so important. It's really about protecting people
Yeah.
and their information. So picking up where we left off with ESAPI,
Yeah, ESAPI.
that toolkit.
Yeah, can we get into the specifics a little bit? Because it sounds like it's super helpful, but how does it actually help with all those risks, those OWASP top 10 risks that we were talking about?
Absolutely. So let's take injection attacks, for example.
Yep.
ESPI gives developers these really powerful tools for input validation and output encoding. So it's kind of like a filter that can scrub out any potentially dangerous code
Okay.
before it can even get into the system or be shown to users.
So it's like stopping those little code snippets that hackers try to slip in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Prevents them from being executed and causing all kinds of trouble.
Yeah.
And then for cross-site scripting, XSS,
Yeah.
ESCPI has output encoding functions that make sure any data that's displayed on a web page
Right.
is properly sanitized.
Right.
So it can't be misinterpreted as executable code.
Okay, so it's like putting that data in a little protective bubble so it can't be weaponized.
I like that. That's a great way to put it. And it goes way beyond just those two risks. Like, it can handle things like authentication, session management, encryption, access control. It really is this comprehensive security suite.
Wow, it sounds like ASAPI is like the ultimate security wingman for developers. Like it's got their back.
It does. And what's even better, it's an open source project,
Oh.
which means it's constantly being updated and improved by a whole community of security experts.
It's like this collective effort to make the internet a safer place.
It is.
Oh,
Absolutely.
I love that.
And I think that's why it's so important for anyone involved in software development,
Right.
even if you're not a programmer,
Yeah.
to at least be aware of these things. OWASP, ESAPI,
Yeah.
these are the resources for building a more secure world, which impacts all of us.
For sure. Okay, so it sounds like we're making some progress
Yeah.
in this battle against cyber attacks. But are we winning? Or is it just this constant back and forth? I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right?
I think we are making progress. But the reality is that attackers are always coming up with new and creative ways to attack systems. It really is an arms race.
Well, it's like a never-ending game of chess, just trying to anticipate the next move.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why security awareness and education are so important. The more we understand about the threats and how they change,
Right.
the better equipped we are to defend against them.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the tech side of things.
Yeah.
But what about the human element? Because aren't people often the weakest link in security? Like, we make mistakes, we click on things we shouldn't.
You're 100% right.
Yeah.
Humans, I mean, we are often the easiest target for these attackers.
Right.
You think about things like phishing scams, weak passwords, just not even knowing those basic security best practices.
Yeah.
Our actions, or sometimes our inaction,
Yeah.
can have really, really big consequences.
So it's not enough to just have strong security systems in place.
Right.
We need to be smarter about how we behave online as well.
We do. It's so important. Security awareness training, that's crucial
Right.
for everyone. Individuals, big organizations. We need to teach people to recognize and avoid those threats, to make strong passwords, to understand multi-factor authentication, all of that, and to report any suspicious activity.
Yeah.
It's like giving people the tools to be their own digital bodyguard.
I like that. It's
Yeah.
like we're all responsible for our own little piece of the internet.
We are. We all have a part to play in this.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about ESAPI. We talked about kind of the human element of security.
Right.
I want to circle back to something you said earlier about good design. You were saying it's not just about defending against the attacks that we know about,
Right.
but also about anticipating future attacks, ones that we can't even imagine yet. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So good design, when it comes to security, it's about building these systems that are fundamentally resilient
Right.
and adaptable. So it's about anticipating those potential weaknesses and putting security measures in place that can actually evolve as the threats change.
So like building systems that can bend without breaking, even when something new comes along?
Precisely. It's like, imagine you're building a house on this super solid foundation.
Right.
Even if a storm comes and knocks down a few walls,
Yeah.
that foundation is still going to be there.
That's a great way to put it. I like that analogy. Okay, so how do we actually go about designing these kinds of systems? What are the guiding principles here?
Well, there are a few key principles. One is called the principle of least privilege.
Okay.
So this means giving users and systems only the bare minimum level of access
Right.
that they need to do their job.
Don't give everyone the keys to the kingdom.
Exactly. And then there's defense in depth.
Okay.
This means putting multiple layers of security in place.
Okay.
So even if one layer fails, you've got backups.
So kind of like a castle with multiple walls and a moat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Another important principle is something called fail-safe defaults.
Okay.
So this means that if a system encounters an error
Yeah.
or some unexpected input, it should default to a secure state,
Okay.
not a vulnerable one.
So it's like having a safety net
Yes.
to minimize the damage
Yes.
if something goes wrong.
Exactly. And then finally, security by design.
Okay.
This one is so important. And it means thinking about security from the very beginning
Yeah.
of the software development process. So
Uh-huh.
like from the initial design phase
Right.
all the way to testing and deployment.
So it's not an afterthought. It's like baked into the whole thing.
Exactly. And by kind of weaving these principles into how we design systems,
Yeah.
we can create software that's just inherently more secure and resilient.
Okay, so we've got least privilege, defense in depth, fail-safe defaults, and security by design. These are like our 4 pillars for
Yeah.
building a more secure digital world. I'm sensing that we're about to dive into even more fascinating stuff.
Oh, you know it. We've laid the groundwork, and now it's time to bring it all home.
Mm.
We're going to see how these concepts play out in the real world.
All right, so we're back. Ready to wrap up our deep dive into secure coding and all this stuff that's going on behind the scenes.
It's been a journey, hasn't it?
It has. It's been really fascinating. We started talking about those design choices that you wouldn't think would matter, but actually, could make or break the internet.
Right.
Then we got into those OWASP top 10 risks, like the scary stuff.
It's scary stuff, yeah.
And of course, ESAPI, our security superhero, which I love.
Our sidekick?
Yeah. It's like the security sidekick that all developers need.
Absolutely.
And we talked about how good design is kind of like building a fortress.
Right. On a solid foundation.
Yeah, on that solid foundation, which is so important.
Absolutely.
It really makes you appreciate all the work that developers do
It does, yeah.
to keep things running smoothly and safely for everyone.
Yeah. It's essential work.
It is, yeah. It's essential, but we don't often think about it.
We don't know.
It's all happening behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We talked about how much of our lives are online now.
It's everything.
Banking, shopping, social media,
Yeah.
healthcare, everything.
Pretty much.
And if something as basic as input can be exploited, like we were talking about,
Right.
what does that mean for the future as things become even more complicated, Like, are we going to be able to keep up?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
As our digital world gets even more interconnected, even more complex, the stakes just get higher.
Right.
Right. I mean, we're going to need even better, stronger, more flexible security measures to keep up with those changes.
Yeah, it does feel like we're entering this whole new era of cybersecurity
We are, yeah.
where the challenges are bigger than ever. It's exciting, but also a little bit scary, to be honest.
It is. It's both.
Yeah.
But I am optimistic. I think the key is to stay informed,
Yeah.
be proactive, and just keep investing in that research, those innovations.
Right.
That's how we'll stay ahead.
Yeah, knowledge is power. And I'm glad that there are people like you out there
Oh, thank
who are thinking about these things. It's reassuring.
Well, there's a whole community of us.
There is. That's good to know.
And I encourage our listeners, if you're interested, to learn more.
Yeah.
There's so much information out there. The book we talked about, Secure and Resilient Software Development, is a great place to start.
Definitely check it out if you're curious. And remember, like we said, the more you know, the better you can protect yourself. So stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe out there.
Absolutely.
All right, that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time.